Robert Clark is the member for Box Hill in the Victorian Parliament. He's the Shadow Minister for Energy and Resources in the Victorian opposition. He's also Shadow Attorney General and Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations. Mr. Clark, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
In simple terms, how will an emission trading scheme affect the Victorian energy sector?
It's going to have a pretty diabolical effect on the Victorian energy sector. The projections are showing that something like 4 out of 5 of the brown coal power stations in the Latrobe Valley will have to close by 2020. That'll have to be replaced by a huge investment in gas-fired plants and also in wind and other renewables. So it's one of the biggest upheavals that the Victorian energy sector has faced for many, many years, if indeed in its entire history.
So is Victoria more vulnerable?
The emissions trading scheme could hit Victoria harder than any other state. We've relied for many years on the cheap but very dirty brown coal in the Latrobe Valley, dirty in a greenhouse sense, and we're no longer going to be able to take advantage of that. So it could imply a huge upheaval for the Victorian manufacturing sector, particularly petrochemicals and other sectors, automotive perhaps, that are reliant on very cheap energy supplies. And we've got to be geared up to cope with that. It's coming very quickly indeed, and 2020 will be upon us in no time at all. My concern is the state government's been very complacent about where we're going. They've been used to coasting on the good times that Victoria's had under the national economy for the last 10 or 15 years, and we're going to come into some pretty heavy headwinds with the changes following from emissions trading.
So which parts of Victoria would be hardest hit?
Well, I think right across the board, but obviously those who are particularly reliant on energy costs. Households are potentially facing power price increases of around 25%. The wholesale energy price could increase by 50% or more, and that will particularly hurt energy-dependent industries. Transport costs, of course, are going to go up, which means that in a sense the distances are going to become more of a barrier, which could hit rural Victoria. And of course in the Latrobe Valley we face the prospect of losing hundreds of jobs and a huge upheaval and need to help those people who are going to be displaced.
When can we see an impact of this?
Well, this is going to take off pretty rapidly. Federal government's talking about getting the scheme up and running by 2010. Of course, we're very much dependent on what's called the trajectory, that is the initial price or restrictions on carbon that are introduced and then how quickly that's ramped up. But certainly the modelling is showing that if you're looking for, say, a 20% reduction in emissions by 2020, which is probably what you're going to be looking at if you want to get 60% by 2050, then it's going to start biting over the coming decade. And certainly if you're an SME or indeed a big business or anybody else, you're going to have to start factoring in big increases in your energy prices and big increases in your transport costs. And if you're in particular industries that are dependent on energy content, maybe petrochemical, other chemical industries, parts of manufacturing, you could be in for a very significant squeeze indeed.
So what is the opposition's stance on what should occur in Victoria now, and is the Victorian government's response adequate?
Well, we support an emissions trading scheme. Once you accept the science of climate change, then an emissions trading scheme is the least cost way of spreading the pain. But what we are very concerned about is that governments, both the state and the incoming federal government, have been very complacent about what's involved. They all said it was going to be easy, they all said yes, they're going to do it, but when you look at the detail, they just haven't done the hard work. I mean, it's been the private sector, the Energy Supply Association, that's done the modelling, that's come up with the calculation that we're going to lose 4 out of 5 brown coal power stations in the Latrobe Valley. That didn't even seem to be on the state government's radar screen. But yet we've got an enormous amount that needs to be done to gear up for those changes. I mean, if we've got to virtually replace the vast bulk of the Latrobe Valley generating capacity, we've got to be able to get the planning done now. We need to identify potential sites, we need to get the planning and approvals process well underway so we can get those plants being built as rapidly as possible when the private sector funds, as we hope they will, come along to be invested. Similarly with wind turbines, they're controversial at the best of times, but we're going to need a huge increase in wind turbine investment in Victoria if you accept the modelling. We've got to make sure they're in the right sites rather than environmentally sensitive sites that are imposed against the will of the local community. So there's an enormous amount to be done, not much time to do it in, and the state government really needs to get its act into gear.
These alternative energy sources, is enough being done?
Well, there is the framework in place to promote alternative energy sources in theory, but what needs to be done is to make sure that they are in the right places at the right times, and everything that needs to go around them is put in place. For example, it's all very well to build wind turbines, but you've got to connect those wind turbines to the grid. What's the transmission augmentation being done that's need to make sure you've got the transmission capacity you need? Again, another significant consequence of emissions trading is that as brown coal usage in Victoria falls away, you're going to get increased reliance in Victoria on black coal generation out of New South Wales. You've got to have those interconnects. If we're going to have geothermal coming out of South Australia, again, how do you connect those to a national grid? There's a huge amount of work to be done, but my fear is that at a state and a federal government level, the current incumbents have been talking in big picture terms about the need for emissions trading, but they haven't done the hard work for the modelling, and so when emissions trading gets underway, I think it's going to be a pretty bumpy ride for all of us.
And finally, we often, for those that listen to 3AW, the breakfast guys always have a little grab that says, we're all going to die. Are we?
It's going to be tough, and one of my big criticisms of the way the Labor side of politics has handled it is they've said for so long it's all going to be easy, just a small sacrifice now and we'll avoid all this trouble down the track. If you accept the science, we need to do it, but it's going to be jolly difficult indeed. I would say, but at best, it'll be an impact perhaps 2 or 3 times greater than the oil price shocks of the 70s. And if it's on the pessimistic side, it's going to be a radical upheaval to our way of life. So I don't think we'll die, but it's going to be pretty uncomfortable along the way.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.